We continue on our journey through the gospel of Jesus Christ as recorded by Matthew the Apostle. We are in chapter 18 and verse 1. I'm reading from the Revised Standard Version. Matthew chapter 18 and verse 1 says this: At that time the disciples came to Jesus saying, Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? What is the greatest danger in the church? Where does the threat to the church come from? Is it attacks from outside the church? Or is it from some alternative religious tradition? Is it from those heretical movements and groups that have grown out of the Christian tradition? If we were to simplify things, the Christian faith, we would say, is in greatest danger from those within the church. And if we were to simplify things in terms of the Christian faith, we could say that it involves two things. On the one hand is the ideology. In this realm, we are saying that the Christian faith involves certain beliefs and certain ideas that give it its uniqueness. The Christian faith also involves certain values. Now, notice that I'm using the word values and not ethics, and that's important because the key is the values, not the ethics. The ethics flow out of our values, but not the values. Now, we are again simplifying things here. Just so to say values are the source of our ethics, and to say so is not to say ethics are unimportant. And so what we are going to say is that the greatest danger and threat to the church comes from within, and it comes over the whole issue of how we regard values or ideology versus values. Now, in theology, we have two broad camps at either end of the spectrum. So if you draw a line, you would have this group here and this group here, and all sorts of gradations in between. On one end of the spectrum is liberalism. On the other end of the spectrum is conservatism. Now, remember, we are simplifying things, and whenever you simplify anything, you do so at the expense of certain facts. To simplify something is not so much about saying what is, but rather it is a tool or means to give us a sense of what we are dealing with. Liberalism, therefore, in the Christian tradition, is where the emphasis is placed on the values of the faith, and the ideology of the faith is discounted. We identify with certain values of the faith. So around the First World War, liberalism was identified with the brotherhood of all mankind. That is a value. But at the same time, the ideology of the Christian faith was largely jettisoned. Simple retelling of theology. And conservatism, the ideology is all important, and the values of the faith are minimized. The besetting sin of liberalism is syncretism, by which is meant that as long as we retain Christian values, we can absorb any ideology. The besetting sin of conservatism is legalism, for here the text of the faith is to be mined for new and more rules. Conservatism puts the emphasis on ideology at the expense of values. Now, if you want to understand the question that is thrust to Jesus in verse 1 of Matthew chapter 18, you need to keep the above in mind, because in theology and in the practice of the faith, there's always these two poles, these two tendencies that have to be kept in check. So what is always linked with And when we look at a question, we always have to link it to context. Now, let me offer up an example here. If your 5-year-old asks you if you still love him, you have the right to be suspicious as to where that question is coming from. If your 5-year-old has just walked out of the living room and he asks you, do you still love him? Is it because he just broke your favorite lamp in the living room? The context to the question of Jesus is all important. This was not the beginning of the ministry. The disciples were awakening to what the ministry of Jesus would lead to. And this was done in a background where there was discussion about ideology and values. Now, again, we are giving you a simple picture here, but I think it is effective to capture what we're dealing with. The Sadducees were the liberals of that day, and the Pharisees were the conservatives of that day. And Jesus destroyed both positions. Let's be very clear. He destroyed both positions. The disciples were discovering it. The disciples, in effect, had their theology destroyed by Jesus. The Sadducees were the Jewish upper class that gave oversight and management to the temple. The Sadducees were the ones who were quite willing to work with the Romans because the Romans were quite willing to recognize the authority of the Sadducees and their oversight of the temple. The Pharisees were rooted in the average person, and the disciples probably started out theologically pretty close to their views. The question of who was the greatest in the kingdom of God was ultimately about where you put your emphasis. Do you put it on values or ideology? The natural tendency in theology is to split these two, become about values or ideology. And Jesus is going to want to say that you must have both ideology and values. An ideology without values is of no good, and values without keeping true to the ideology is also bad. Look at any group and see where they put their emphasis, and you can see where they fit on the spectrum. Jesus would, through this question, affirm both values and ideology at the expense of those on either side of the spectrum.